The night my heart stopped in my first life, the ballroom glittered like something immortal, as though wealth itself could defy decay. Crystal chandeliers trembled under golden light, string music swelled and softened in careful crescendos, and men in pressed uniforms stood with their hands clasped behind their backs like monuments carved from discipline. I remember watching Daniel from across the polished floor, the metals on his chest catching light in precise flashes, his expression controlled in the way only long years of command could refine. He looked untouchable, unshakable, admired by every person who mattered in that room. And yet, for all that prestige, there was an absence between us that no applause could disguise. We had built a life on what seemed sensible at 22: stability, decency, mutual respect. But I had mistaken composure for warmth and quiet loyalty for intimacy. My sister Victoria, standing near the balcony in a gown that seemed designed to provoke envy, caught my eye over the rim of her champagne glass and smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, but knowingly. She had always understood that power was as much about perception as possession, and in that final hour of my first life, I realized she believed I had won something she deserved. The irony was that I had never truly possessed what she envied. I collapsed before midnight. There was no dramatic farewell, no whispered reconciliation, only a tightening in my chest and the distant sensation of glass shattering as my body met the floor. When I opened my eyes again, I was 22 years old, staring at the pale blue ceiling of my childhood bedroom, sunlight spilling through curtains that had not yet faded with time. For a long moment I did not move, because memory is heavier than muscle, and I felt both lifetimes pressing against my ribs. Downstairs, Victoria's voice floated upward, bright, ambitious, full of plans that had not yet hardened into regret. That sound confirmed what the ceiling already had. I had returned to the day everything diverged. The day we chose. In our first life, I had stepped toward Daniel almost instinctively, drawn to his steadiness after years of competing with Victoria's brilliance. She had dismissed him then as too reserved, too serious, too structured to suit her hunger for spectacle. That hesitation had allowed me to claim him without resistance. But this time, when I descended the staircase and found both men waiting in the living room, Ethan Whitmore restless and charismatic, Daniel Hayes composed and observant, I understood that choice was less about opportunity and more about self-knowledge. Daniel's eyes met mine, steady as ever. And for the first time I saw beyond the uniform he would one day earn. I saw a man who required alignment, not admiration, partnership, not applause. Victoria noticed the glance between us. She noticed everything. And something shifted behind her smile. Her decision unfolded with calculated grace. At dinner that evening, she surprised our parents by expressing interest in Daniel rather than Ethan, praising his discipline, his clarity, the honor of a structured life. It was a performance so subtle it almost seemed sincere. Daniel, true to his nature, responded not with passion, but with consideration. He believed in building affection through commitment, in allowing loyalty to mature into love. Victoria mistook that belief for pliability. She thought structure could be shaped by enough charm. I remained silent throughout the courtship that followed, neither warning her nor competing for attention. For once in my life I did not measure my worth against hers. I watched. I listened. And I chose differently. When they announced their engagement, Victoria sought me out with that familiar glint of triumph, expecting to find envy in my expression. I gave her none. Instead of anchoring myself to a man whose future would eclipse my own identity, I accepted a fellowship in Washington, stepping into policy analysis and strategic advisory work that demanded rigor rather than glamour. It was not flashy. No cameras followed late-night drafting sessions or classified briefings. But it was foundational. Meanwhile, Victoria married into structure believing she could transform it into spectacle. The early months of her marriage were defined not by cruelty, but by incompatibility. Daniel's deployments, his quiet routines, his preference for substance over display, all of it began to grate against her desire for visibility. She had imagined prestige without understanding the solitude that accompanies duty. Years passed in steady increments. Daniel rose through the ranks not because he sought attention, but because he excelled under pressure. His promotions were earned through competence rather than charm, and with each advancement, Victoria expected her own influence to expand. Instead, she found herself orbiting a career that required humility she did not possess. Ethan Whitmore's tech empire, meanwhile, exploded into national headlines, and Victoria followed his interviews with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She would never admit it aloud, but she mourned the version of herself that might have stood beside that volatile brilliance. I, working in quieter corridors, observed the fragility beneath Ethan's expansion, the regulatory shortcuts, the inflated projections. Having lived through his eventual collapse once before, I recognized instability disguised as innovation. The first visible crack in Victoria's composure appeared not during a scandal, but at a formal reception where Daniel and I found ourselves engaged in extended professional conversation. There was nothing improper in it, only mutual respect, sharpened by years of independent growth. But Victoria watched from across the room with a stillness that felt almost predatory. She understood then what she had miscalculated. Daniel responded not to admiration, but to equilibrium. And for the first time since our childhood, I saw uncertainty eclipse her confidence. Not because she feared losing wealth or status, but because she sensed that significance cannot be manufactured through proximity. It must be earned through alignment. That realization marked the true beginning of her unraveling, though neither of us admitted it aloud. The foundation had been laid, the choices cemented. The second life had diverged from the first, not through dramatic confrontation, but through restraint. And restraint, I would soon learn, is the most powerful rebellion of all. Victoria did not unravel all at once. That would have been too merciful, too clean. Instead, she came apart in small, almost imperceptible fractures, the way ice splinters beneath weight before anyone hears it crack. From the outside, her life still shimmered. The charity luncheons, the polished interviews about military family resilience, the curated photographs of her standing beside Daniel in tailored gowns while he wore promotions like armor. But I began to see the pauses in her smile, the way her fingers tightened around champagne stems, the way she watched him when he wasn't looking at her at all. Daniel had not grown cruel. That was the tragedy. He had grown distant in a way that was disciplined, almost principled, as if withdrawing emotion were simply another duty he had accepted without complaint. He fulfilled every obligation, financial, social, ceremonial. But affection cannot be commanded like troops, and admiration cannot be staged like a gala. Victoria had married a man of structure, believing she could bend him towards spectacle, and now she found herself orbiting a planet that would never change its gravity for her. The scandal that finally shook her did not originate from Daniel, but from the ghost of the path she had abandoned. Ethan Whitmore's trial dominated headlines for months. Former investors testified, employees defected, and the same outlets that once crowned him visionary now dissected him with surgical cruelty. Victoria followed every article obsessively. Not because she loved him. She never truly loved anyone so much as the life they represented. But because his collapse felt like a mirror she had narrowly escaped. The difference was that Ethan's fall was loud and humiliating, while her disappointment was silent and suffocating. She had gambled on permanence and won it, yet permanence came without applause, without feverish admiration, without the glittering chaos she secretly craved. And in that quiet suffocation, she began to look at me differently, not as the sister she had outmaneuvered, but as the anomaly she could not understand. By then, my work had placed me inside rooms where strategies were drafted long before the public learned of them. I did not seek recognition. Influence felt cleaner when unnamed. Daniel and I encountered each other often across conference tables layered with classified briefings and controlled urgency. Our conversations remained professional, at first measured exchanges about logistics, about long-term readiness, about policy vulnerabilities, but beneath the formal cadence ran an undercurrent neither of us acknowledged aloud. It was not romance in the reckless sense. It was recognition. We understood each other's restraint, each other's appetite for responsibility over spectacle. Sometimes his gaze would linger a fraction too long, as if he were recalibrating an old memory against a new reality. And in those moments I would feel the faint echo of the first life, the one where I had chased him out of fear rather than standing beside him out of equal footing. The difference this time was that I wanted nothing from him that was not freely given, and that absence of hunger altered everything. Victoria noticed before either of us spoke a single improper word. She had always possessed an instinct for shifts in energy, for currents beneath still water. One evening, after a particularly tense reception celebrating Daniel's newest appointment, promotion that placed him closer to national leadership than even his harshest critics predicted, she confronted me in a private corridor lined with framed portraits of men who had shaped decades of policy. Her composure was immaculate, but her eyes betrayed a rawness she could not powder away. She accused me of maneuvering, of positioning myself deliberately within Daniel's sphere, of waiting patiently for the cracks in her marriage to widen. The irony almost made me laugh because, if anything, I had spent years constructing a life independent enough that no one could accuse me of orbiting anyone. I told her, calmly and without venom, that the only difference between us was that I no longer needed a man's title to validate my existence. The words struck harder than any insult could have, because they exposed the truth she had spent her entire life outrunning. The unraveling accelerated after that. Victoria attempted to reclaim Daniel the only way she knew how: through performance. She organized elaborate functions, aligned herself with influential spouses, reinvented her image as a strategic partner rather than a restless accessory. For a time, the efforts seemed to work. Public perception shifted. Photographs circulated of them appearing united, composed, almost enviable. But private fractures cannot be permanently concealed by curated lighting. Daniel's patience thinned not in anger, but in exhaustion. He had chosen marriage believing commitment was a fortress. He had not anticipated sharing that fortress with someone who resented its walls. Eventually, the arguments ceased not because they resolved anything, but because he stopped engaging. Silence, I learned long ago, is a far more devastating verdict than shouting. The moment everything tipped beyond recovery arrived quietly, almost anticlimactically, during a strategic retreat where I had been assigned to coordinate cross-department analysis. A leak, minor but politically dangerous, surfaced within Daniel's division. It was not catastrophic, but it was enough to invite scrutiny from rivals eager to stall his ascent. The investigation that followed was methodical, invasive, relentless. Victoria panicked, fearing that proximity to controversy would tarnish the prestige she had clung to for so long. Instead of supporting him, she distanced herself, issuing statements through carefully chosen intermediaries, emphasizing transparency and independence, as though preemptively separating her identity from his. Daniel, who valued loyalty above all virtues, absorbed that betrayal with a stillness that frightened even me. The leak was ultimately traced to an external contractor. His record remained unblemished. But something inside their marriage did not survive the inquiry. In the weeks after the investigation closed, Daniel requested a private meeting with me. Not in secrecy, not in impropriety, but in clarity. He spoke without ornament, admitting that he had once mistaken Victoria's intensity for strength, and that he now recognized the difference between ambition and stability. He did not confess love. Daniel was not a man who weaponized vulnerability. Instead, he expressed regret, not for marrying her, but for failing to understand himself sooner. Listening to him, I felt no triumph. Only a profound, almost sorrowful awareness of how choice, once made, radiates consequences across years. I told him gently that regret is a compass, not a time machine. We cannot return to crossroads. We can only decide who we are from this point forward. Victoria filed for separation 3 months later, citing irreconcilable differences and a desire to pursue independent ventures. The phrasing was clinical, strategic, almost brand-conscious. Privately, she confronted me one final time, her voice stripped of its usual polish. She accused fate of cruelty, accused me of patience that bordered on calculation, accused Daniel of emotional betrayal. But beneath the accusations lay something far simpler. She had mistaken possession for connection, and when possession proved insufficient, she had nothing left to anchor her. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I simply told her that this life, unlike the last, had given us both a second chance not to win, but to understand. Whether she chose understanding was no longer within my control. Daniel and I did not rush into anything once the divorce finalized. We had both learned the cost of choices made from insecurity. What grew between us unfolded slowly, built not on rebellion or revenge but on alignment. We collaborated, debated, disagreed with respect. And in that deliberate construction, I felt something unfamiliar to both of my lifetimes: equilibrium. There were no chandeliers trembling overhead, no champagne-fueled rivalries, no desperate need to prove superiority. Only two people who had finally arrived at themselves before reaching for each other. Years later, at another formal ceremony marking Daniel's appointment to one of the highest advisory positions in the country, I stood beside him not as a trophy, not as a symbol, but as a partner whose own name carried weight in separate corridors of influence. Cameras flashed, applause echoed, and for a fleeting second I remembered the ballroom where my first life ended, how fragile everything had seemed beneath glittering lights. This time nothing felt fragile. Victoria watched from a distance, her expression unreadable, her ventures moderately successful but never transformative. She had not been destroyed. Life is rarely that theatrical. But she had learned, perhaps too late, that significance cannot be stolen from someone else's shadow. It must be built in one's own light. And as the applause faded into the steady rhythm of a future chosen with open eyes rather than trembling fear, I understood that rebirth had never been about reclaiming a man. It had been about reclaiming myself.